We're told that aging means accommodating others. What rubbish! This dangerous mythology strips you of dignity precisely when you should be guarding it most fiercely. People will make demands on your time, money, and energy that you cannot and should not fulfill. The boundaries you establish now determine your quality of life. These 7 requests you must refuse aren't just suggestions, they're psychological imperatives. You have a responsibility to yourself. Stand firm or surrender your autonomy. The choice is yours. Let me tell you about Harold, a retired engineer I counseled. He'd spent 45 years building bridges, structures that connected people while maintaining their integrity through precise boundaries. Yet in retirement, he couldn't establish boundaries in his own life. His daughter started asking for small loans that grew larger each month. He felt trapped between paternal duty and financial security. I built structures that could withstand tremendous pressure, he told me, but I can't withstand the pressure of saying no to my own child. This phenomenon runs deeper than mere politeness. What we're witnessing is the corruption of the archetypal father figure, transformed from respected elder to exploitable resource. There's a psychological principle at work here. As your visible productivity decreases, others unconsciously recategorize you from provider to provider of resources. It's not malevolence, it's human nature operating at a level most aren't conscious of. The problem isn't that people ask, it's that you feel obligated to give despite the cost to yourself. Your financial stability represents more than numbers in an account. It embodies your life's work, your security, and fundamentally your freedom to choose how you live these precious years. When someone, even family, approaches you for financial assistance, they're not simply requesting money, they're making a claim on your past efforts and future security. This is why refusing such requests feels so difficult. It triggers ancient provider impulses and social expectations of generosity. The first psychological trap appears when the request seems small. It's just $200, or I'll pay you back next month. But these initial requests establish a dangerous precedent. Each time you acquiesce, you're not just transferring funds, you're transferring power. You're programming others to see you as an ATM rather than a person with legitimate needs and finite resources. The most effective response begins with a pause. Resist the deeply ingrained impulse to answer immediately. Simply state, I need to consider this request. I'll get back to you. This delay breaks the emotional manipulation that comes with in-person appeals. Then examine the request against your financial reality, not your emotional response. Is this consistent with your financial boundaries? Will this impact your ability to maintain independence? These aren't selfish questions, they're survival questions. When you do respond, clarity is kindness. Vague answers invite negotiation. I'm not in a position to provide financial assistance is stronger than I don't think I can help right now. The former closes the door, the latter leaves it ajar. Remember that your financial security isn't just about you, it's about avoiding becoming a burden to others later. Every dollar given away potentially becomes $2 someone else might need to provide for you in the future. Notice what happens inside you when money requests come, the tightness in your chest, the flush of shame at the thought of refusal. These are emotional reactions, not rational assessments. Your body is remembering old patterns of provision, protection, and approval seeking. Recognize these sensations as evolutionary echoes, not commands you must obey. Now let's address your valuable time, the most irreplaceable currency you possess at this stage of life. While money can be replenished to some degree, time cannot. Yet people will ask for it casually, as though your calendar sits perpetually empty, waiting to be filled with their priorities rather than yours. The myth persists that retirement means unlimited leisure, a dangerous falsehood that others exploit, consciously or not. I recall meeting Thomas, a retired history professor whose family began treating his home as a perpetual daycare center. They dropped the grandchildren off without asking, he confided, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. I loved them dearly, but I had plans for these years, books to write, places to see. His calendar had been colonized, his aspirations buried beneath others' convenience. Time in your senior years carries paradoxical weight. It's simultaneously more limited and more valuable. The psychological reality is stark. You have fewer days ahead than behind. This isn't morbid, it's mathematically true. And yet society encourages a strange dissociation, treating your time as less valuable precisely when it should be most precious. This cognitive dissonance between reality and societal expectation creates the perfect vulnerability for exploitation. When someone asks for your Tuesday afternoon to help them move furniture or requests that you watch their children just for a few hours, they're not merely requesting minutes, they're claiming your life force. Time requests carry hidden costs, preparation beforehand, recovery afterward, and the psychological drain of task switching at an age when such transitions require more energy. What appears as a 3-hour commitment might actually consume an entire day of your vitality. The solution begins with an honest calendar audit. How much time do you need for your own physical maintenance, exercise, proper meal preparation, medical appointments? How much for intellectual stimulation and creative pursuits? For meaningful social connection? Map these necessities before allocating a single minute elsewhere. Your time boundaries must emerge from this reality, not from others' expectations or your habitual patterns of accommodation. Practice the phrase, "I've committed that time to previous plans." Notice I didn't say I'm busy, a claim others feel entitled to evaluate. Your plans might include reading in solitude or simply recovering your energy, activities others might not recognize as legitimate demands. You needn't justify how you spend your hours, you must simply claim them decisively. Your living space, this sanctuary you've earned, represents the third boundary you must fiercely protect. Consider Edward, who reluctantly allowed his adult son to stay temporarily following a divorce. 6 months later, Edward found himself relegated to a single bedroom in his own home, his routines disrupted, his peace shattered. "I feel like a guest in my own house," he admitted, the shame evident in his downcast eyes. The psychology is fascinating here. Your home embodies more than shelter. It's the physical manifestation of your autonomy. The arrangement of furniture, the timing of meals, the temperature setting, these seemingly minor details comprise the architecture of your independence. When someone asks to occupy your space, whether for storage, extended stays, or frequent visits, they're requesting partial claim to your domain of control. This boundary violation operates at multiple levels. First, there's the physical intrusion, objects occupying space, noise disrupting quiet, different standards of cleanliness creating tension. Deeper lies the psychological invasion, the implicit pressure to adjust your behaviors to accommodate another's presence. Deepest of all sits the existential encroachment, the subtle message that your space isn't truly yours to define. The protective response requires brutal honesty with yourself first. What aspects of your living situation are non-negotiable for your well-being? Is it morning quiet, evening solitude, the freedom to eat when hungry rather than on someone else's schedule? Identify these needs before any request arises, so your boundaries emerge from self-knowledge rather than reaction. When declining housing requests, specificity prevents renegotiation. "My home environment is carefully calibrated for my health needs," carries more weight than "I don't think that would work out." Most critically, understand that protecting your living space isn't selfishness, it's self-preservation at a time when environmental stability directly impacts your cognitive and emotional health. I met Richard during a particularly challenging period of his life. At 72, this former business executive found himself surrounded by family members during a routine medical appointment, all insisting he undergo an aggressive treatment his doctor had merely presented as one option. "They talked about me as if I wasn't there," Richard told me, voice steady but eyes revealing the wound. "My son actually said, 'Dad doesn't understand the implications. I built and sold 3 companies, but suddenly I'm incapable of making decisions about my own body.'" This scenario reveals a profound psychological mechanism, the infantilization of the aging. It begins subtly, perhaps with someone speaking louder than necessary, or explaining simple concepts as if you've lost cognitive capacity rather than merely gained perspective. Left unchallenged, this pattern escalates until your medical autonomy, your fundamental right to bodily sovereignty, becomes communal property in others' minds. The stakes could not be higher. Medical decisions represent the most intimate exercise of your autonomy, choices that determine not just how you live, but potentially how and when you die. When someone attempts to usurp this authority, whether family member, caregiver, or even medical professional, they're not simply offering advice, they're attempting to override your existential agency. They're suggesting, however implicitly, that your life is no longer fully your own. Protecting this boundary begins with preparation. Arrive at appointments with written questions. Take notes or record discussions with permission. Bring one trusted advocate, not a committee. These practical steps signal competence and deter the well-meaning but dangerous tendency of others to take control. Remember, the moment you enter a medical setting, you're navigating systems designed for efficiency, not autonomy. Your preparation counterbalances this institutional momentum. The language you employ creates a fortress around your medical sovereignty. Practice phrases like, "I appreciate your concern, but I need to consider this information independently, or I'll be making this decision after consulting with my doctor." Notice these statements acknowledge others' input without surrendering your authority. They close the door to debate while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Most crucially, understand the psychological underpinnings of medical coercion. When loved ones pressure you towards certain treatments, they're often acting from their own fear. Fear of loss, fear of change, fear of mortality. Recognizing this doesn't mean yielding to their pressure. It means responding to the human concern beneath the controlling behavior. I understand this is difficult for you too. Acknowledges their emotion without ceding your rightful authority. Now consider your legacy and possessions, items that transcend monetary value to become repositories of meaning and memory. David, a widower of 15 years, described his adult children's behavior during a family gathering. They were placing post-it notes on furniture while I was napping, claiming things as if I were already gone. The pain in his voice wasn't about the objects, it was about his ongoing existence being treated as a technicality, his life reduced to an inconvenient delay before distribution. The psychology here cuts deep. Your possessions represent more than material goods. They embody your history, identity, and the physical manifestation of your life's narrative. Each item carries stories invisible to others. The chair where you read to your children, the watch that marked career milestones, the dishes that held countless family meals. When someone prematurely lays claim to these objects, they're not simply requesting items, they're hastening your symbolic erasure. This boundary violation often masquerades as practical planning. "I'm just wondering what you want done with these things" seems innocent enough. But examine the unstated assumption that decisions about your possessions should be made now, under others' timetables rather than yours. This isn't planning, it's presumption. Protecting this boundary requires both practical and psychological strategies. Practically, consider creating a written legacy plan, not because you're obligated to, but because it places distribution on your terms and timeline. More importantly, develop language that firmly redirects premature inheritance discussions. "These items are still serving me well in my life," or "I'm not ready to discuss the distribution of my possessions." The deeper psychological work involves reconciling your relationship with material goods. Ask yourself, what objects truly matter to me? Which ones carry meaning I want preserved versus practical value others might need? This clarity helps distinguish between legitimate legacy discussions and boundary violations dressed as practical concerns. The emotional labor others expect from you represents perhaps the most subtle yet depleting boundary transgression of all. Margaret, a retired school principal who'd spent decades mediating conflicts and nurturing others, found herself overwhelmed at 69. "My phone rings constantly," she confessed. "My daughter's marital problems, my grandson's college applications, my friends' health concerns. Everyone wants my wisdom, my comfort, my solutions." Her eyes, once bright with purpose, now showed exhaustion. "When do I get to put down the emotional responsibility I've carried my entire life?" This phenomenon, the unconscious draining of senior emotional resources, operates through powerful psychological mechanisms. Throughout your productive years, you likely developed expertise in crisis management, relationship navigation, and emotional regulation. These skills became your identity capital, valuable abilities others recognized and relied upon. The cruel paradox: precisely when your emotional energy requires careful conservation, others increase their demands on it, seeing your retirement as emotional availability rather than a new chapter of self-determination. The psychological principle at work is transactional entitlement, the unconscious belief that your emotional resources exist for others' benefit. This entitlement manifests through crisis calls at inconvenient hours, lengthy sessions of emotional unburdening without reciprocity, or the expectation that you'll mediate family conflicts. Each instance seems reasonable in isolation, but collectively they create a damaging pattern where your emotional well-being becomes subordinate to others' needs. Protecting your emotional energy requires recognizing its finite nature. At earlier life stages, you could perhaps work all day, counsel a friend through crisis in the evening, and still recharge overnight. The neurobiological reality of aging changes this equation. Your emotional recovery takes longer now. Your capacity for sustained emotional labor diminishes even as your wisdom increases. This isn't weakness, It's your brain's shifting neurochemistry demanding respect. Strategic responses begin with creating temporal boundaries. Designate specific times when you're available for substantive emotional support versus casual connection. When someone calls with a crisis, you might say, "This sounds important. I can give you my full attention tomorrow at 2 p.m. for an hour." This approach honors both their need and your limitations. It transforms unbounded emotional claims into defined exchanges you can prepare for and recover from. The most challenging aspect is implementing these boundaries with those closest to you, adult children who've always relied on your guidance, friends who've known you as the strong one, partners accustomed to your emotional labor. With these intimate connections, gradual recalibration works better than abrupt change. Begin by shortening emotional support sessions. Follow up the next day rather than extending into hours. Redirect minor issues while remaining available for genuine crises. Remember that protecting your emotional reserves isn't selfishness, it's survival. Every emotional interaction carries a neurochemical cost, drawing on limited resources of cortisol regulation and oxytocin production. Managing these resources isn't optional at your life stage. It's essential for cognitive health and emotional well-being. The psychological truth is stark: allowing others to deplete your emotional energy doesn't help them in the long run. It merely postpones their development of alternative support systems. Your personal opinions and values, your intellectual and moral autonomy, represent the final territory requiring vigorous defense. Consider Gerald, a retired judge who found himself increasingly silenced at family gatherings. Whenever I express a political view he shared, someone patronizingly says, "That's just how people your age think." 70 years of thought and experience dismissed as generational bias. The pain in his voice wasn't about political disagreement, it was about intellectual erasure. This boundary violation operates through a particularly insidious form of ageism, the assumption that your perspectives have calcified rather than matured, that your values reflect outdated biases rather than considered wisdom. It manifests in conversations where your views are politely acknowledged then swiftly dismissed, where others perform listening without actual consideration, where your decades of experience are treated as historical artifacts rather than living insight. The psychological dynamics here reveal society's discomfort with elderhood as a distinct life stage with its own valid perspective. Western culture, obsessed with youth and innovation, struggles to value the long view, the understanding that comes only through witnessing multiple cycles of change. This cultural blindness creates the perfect conditions for dismissing senior perspectives as irrelevant rather than recognizing them as essential counterbalance to short-term thinking. Defending your intellectual autonomy begins with language that preemptively addresses dismissal. Rather than simply stating opinions, frame them with reference to your experience. Having seen 3 major financial downturns, I notice a pattern here. This approach doesn't guarantee respect, but it makes your experiential basis explicit and harder to dismiss. It positions your perspective as data-driven rather than merely preferential. The deeper work involves maintaining intellectual vitality while holding firm on core values. Continue engaging with new ideas in evolving cultural contexts, not to abandon your principles, but to articulate them in contemporary terms. This approach defeats the stereotype of rigidity while preserving your essential convictions. It demonstrates that your views result from ongoing reflection rather than mere habit or nostalgia. Most fundamentally, recognize that your moral and intellectual perspective isn't just personally valuable, it's culturally necessary. In a society increasingly driven by algorithmic thinking and short-term metrics, your long-horizon wisdom provides essential balance. When you defend your right to hold and express considered opinions, you're not merely protecting your dignity, you're preserving. When Daniel, a 76-year-old former architect, first came to my office, his presentation was remarkable. Physically straight-backed despite his years, yet psychologically stooped under the weight of others' expectations. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted quietly. "Everyone takes pieces of me, my savings, my weekends, my energy, my space, until there's nothing left that feels like mine." 6 months later, after establishing firm boundaries in each area we've discussed, he returned transformed. "For the first time since retirement, I'm actually living my life rather than serving my usefulness to others." This transformation reveals the integrative nature of the boundaries we've explored. Each protection, financial, temporal, spatial, medical, material, emotional, and intellectual, reinforces the others. Together, they create not merely a defensive perimeter, but a positive definition of selfhood that persists regardless of productivity metrics or social utility. This is the psychological alchemy of proper boundaries. They transmute protection into possibility. The interconnection becomes evident when you examine how these boundaries function as a system. Consider how protecting your financial resources preserves the freedom to allocate your time according to your values, how guarding your time creates space for emotional rejuvenation, how maintaining your living space as a sanctuary enables the quiet reflection necessary for clear medical decisions. Each boundary strengthens the others in a virtuous cycle of self-reclamation. Yet implementing this integrated boundary system requires confronting a profound psychological obstacle, the fear of abandonment. Many seniors quietly wonder, if I stop being useful, if I stop saying yes to everything asked of me, will I be alone? This fear drives compliance with unreasonable requests and surrender to boundary violations. It creates the irrational but emotionally powerful equation: usefulness equals worthiness equals connection. The psychological truth contradicts this fear. Meaningful relationships, the connections that sustain rather than drain, are precisely those that respect boundaries. When you establish clear limits, you don't drive away authentic connection, you filter out exploitative interactions while creating space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than utility. You discover who values your presence versus who values your function. This filtering process requires temporary discomfort, the courage to disappoint others, to witness their reaction when your utility diminishes. Some relationships may indeed fade when you cease being endlessly accommodating. This loss feels threatening until you recognize it for what it truly is: the natural falling away of connections that were transactional rather than authentic. This pruning isn't loss, it's clarification. The implementation strategy requires precision. Begin with small, clear boundary assertions in lower stakes contexts before progressing to more challenging situations. Notice your emotional response during boundary setting, the guilt, anxiety, or fear that arises, without allowing these emotions to dictate your actions. These feelings aren't moral imperatives, they're conditioned responses from years of prioritizing others' needs above your own. Most critically, recognize that proper boundaries paradoxically increase your capacity for genuine generosity. When giving stems from choice rather than obligation, from abundance rather than depletion, it transforms from resentful compliance to meaningful contribution. Your yes carries weight precisely because you've reclaimed your right to say no. This is the ultimate psychological liberation, the freedom to give from authentic choice rather than habitual capitulation. The resistance you'll encounter when establishing these boundaries reveals much about others' unconscious expectations. Some will label your self-protection as selfishness, your discernment as difficulty, your autonomy as obstinance. This relabeling represents their discomfort with your changing role in their lives. Their reactions aren't your responsibility to manage. They're inevitable growing pains as relationships recalibrate to your rightful autonomy. As you implement these protective measures, pay close attention to your physical responses. Notice how your breathing changes when you successfully maintain a boundary, how tension releases from your shoulders when you decline an inappropriate request without apology, how sleep improves when you're no longer subconsciously processing resentment toward those who take without consideration. Your body registers the truth of proper boundaries before your conscious mind fully embraces them. This journey toward protected autonomy isn't selfish indulgence, it's existential necessity. The cultural narrative that equates senior value with continued service represents a fundamental misunderstanding of human development. Your final decades aren't meant for extended servitude. They're designed for integration, the synthesis of experience into wisdom, the distillation of activity into meaning. This integration cannot occur without the protective space created by proper boundaries. The ultimate truth emerges clearly. In refusing these 7 inappropriate requests, you aren't diminishing your role in others' lives. You're fulfilling your responsibility to age with dignity and purpose. This refusal isn't retreat, it's rightful reclamation of the space required to complete your unique human journey. The wisdom you cultivate within these protected boundaries becomes your greatest legacy, far more valuable than any resource others might extract from you through inappropriate demands. Your boundaries aren't mere personal preferences, they're the architecture of your dignity in these final chapters. The greatest danger isn't in disappointing others, it's in betraying yourself through endless accommodation. Each time you stand firm against inappropriate demands, you're not just protecting resources, you're declaring your fundamental worth beyond utility. The alternative is clear: surrender these boundaries and watch meaning dissolve into resentment, purpose into servitude. Life at any stage demands courage, but especially now when society mistakes your wisdom for weakness. So face this truth squarely. No one can guard your sovereignty but you. The question isn't whether you've earned the right to protect these boundaries, it's whether you have the courage to do so.